Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with yet another episode of Marksism, with my fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark LiVecche and Mark Melton. And we're going to start our riveting conversation by focusing on a review just published this morning by Brian Miller on an important new book by Reformed theologian Van Drunen on politics after Christendom, in which Van Drunen asserts or constructs a whole political theology around a few Bible verses in the Old Testament, Genesis specifically, in which the Lord instructs Noah that he who sheds a man's blood, so shall his blood be shed. And so, in effect, Van Drunen is promoting a libertarian Christian political theology in which the state basically creates a system of basic order, punishes the wicked, but otherwise lets society function on its own. At least that's my interpretation. Mark LiVecche, what are your thoughts on Van Drunen's proposed political theology?
A little bit of a qualifier at first. I have not read Politics After Christendom myself yet, so my comments are going to follow on Miller's review, and I look forward to Dan Strand having a longer discussion with a couple of Van Drunen scholars next week in one of the sort of the True North videos. Based on Miller's analysis, yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath that Van Drunen has resolved all our questions about the role of government and human life. The idea, as you present it, of a libertarian government that is very truncated in its aspirations and only seeks to protect the innocent, to punish injustices, and to maintain the order, that sounds great. I would love for you to sign me up for that. But again, as the ongoing questions about what political life should look like continue to make clear, such neutrality only works, or such a limited reach only works when our political opponents behave like we behave. If one group thinks that they're in a full cage, full contact fight, and the other side's trying to be neutral and limited in its aspirations, they're probably going to get run roughshod over. So again, this question of neutrality isn't answered by the application of a few biblical verses and aspirations toward limited government. Not everybody behaves the same way. So again, we still need answers to how to live together when not everybody is playing by the same rules.
Mark Melton, it's my understanding that a more traditional Calvinist political theology would more vigorously assert that the state has a responsibility to advocate for the common good versus Van Drunen's much more minimalist view of the state. What think you?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what Calvin would have said. I know that in one of the books by Keller that I read cited Calvin as saying that, talking about like treating people as God would treat them, and talking about that being the root of our interactions with others, and kind of in using the government in that perspective. But I'm not exactly sure exactly what a lot of the other exactly Calvinist thought would be. But what was the second part of your question again?
Well, your thoughts as a Presbyterian in terms of constructing a new libertarian Christian political theology in which the state's vocation is very constrained.
Well, I think there's a lot of, pragmatic considerations that need to be made. I think that it was Jonathan Leeman who wrote in Providence a while back, where we're talking about Augustinian liberalism, or liberal. I think he used the word liberal Augustinian, where he was an Augustinian first, and then he added a liberal lens to it. And he mentioned like a pragmatic perspective on that. He said, like, if he was like on a desert island full of pirates, he wouldn't want all the pirates that outnumbered him to have a democratic vote. And so I think that there is a good, there's a certain amount of pragmatism of, we use liberalism because it, allows us the most freedom possible. And I know in other places where when the state becomes more involved in religion, the state then, if the state becomes liberal, then the state forces the church to become liberal. I've seen this, I think it was in either Norway or Sweden, that forced the church to change its translation of the Bible after the socialists kind of took control over the government. And so I think that, yeah, again, there's a certain amount of, we use liberalism as a pragmatic tool to maximize the amount of good that can be done in the country.
Mark LiVecche, we also published this piece by Corey Higdon, a PhD student at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, about the death of history. Obviously, this is very timely, in which wokeness and political correctness are attempting to cancel out key historical figures because of their sins, real or imagined, and excluding their accomplishments. And Corey Higdon argues that this is, of course, not a Christian perspective, and that Christianity would understand all people as by nature depraved, certainly sinful, but also used by God for redemptive purposes. And so, for example, we have this statement or report from the Washington, D.C. government released this week, in which virtually every historical figure prior to 1960 is being canceled in terms of who has monuments or who has buildings named for them in the city of D.C. And the report cites Benjamin Franklin having said something unhelpful about race when he was a middle-aged man, but virtually ignoring everything else he accomplished in his life, including his opposition to slavery. So, Mark LiVecche, what do you say about the importance of history from a Christian perspective, and how do we address our current moment?
The importance of history is I think unable to be overstated, simply said. I think Higgins is right. History can be seen as one of the arts of storytelling. Storytelling is vital to human experience. The importance of story is known by everybody from advertisers to evangelists to politicians. The story has an effect on how we perceive ourselves as societies, at a national level, at a small level, where our family stories shape who we are as a LiVecche, as a Melton, as a Tooley, right? That matters as we go forth then into the larger societies. Our collective stories have an effect on not just on who we perceive ourselves to be as a people, but as moral perceivers. So the stories we tell affect how we perceive morality. How we perceive morality is going to have an effect on how we perceive moral conflict, and is going to have an effect on our moral actions. An example I heard recently is, you consider a forest fairly static, factual thing, but many people will perceive that forest differently. Some people will perceive the forest simply as a beautiful thing that ought to be preserved as its own inherent good. Other people will perceive the forest as timber and as an economic value. An environmentalist might see it as a way of scrubbing the air and keeping pollutants free, so it should be sustained for the sake of health. So how one perceives something is going to affect how they act toward it. And so history is vital, because history shapes character. I just onboarded here at the Naval Academy, and you walk around the grounds of the Naval Academy or any building within the Naval Academy, just as you would walking along the mall in Washington, D.C., as you've touched on, and you are surrounded by storytelling elements, by monuments, by plaques, by images that endeavor to shape how we perceive who we are. And, at the Naval Academy or in the mall in Washington, D.C., a part of who we are is the vocation of being a human being, or the vocation of being an American. And the stories we tell ourselves shape our perceptions about what it means to be those things. And those things then shape our perceptions of how we act in the world today. I think this report that you're citing is kind of chronological fascism. The incredibly arrogant idea that we today are somehow morally pure in ways that our ancestors were not. is dangerous, arrogant, stupid. It's naive to the nth degree, and it's poison. So yeah, history is a battleground, and we have to have a better way of telling the story than some of the folks who are running roughshod in our streets today. And by streets, I mean the academy, the church, as well as downtown.
So Mark Melton, if we could sift through your lifetime of email and find some unfortunate statement from 15 years ago, may we cancel you once and forever based on that, without any possibility of redemption or acknowledging positive accomplishments in your life?
Well, I think, of course, the Christian answer is that you have a right to, not a right, like God has a right to destroy us for our sins, but we have the salvation, and that Jesus takes upon the destruction that we deserve. And so then, because we have the, because we've received salvation, we give it to others. And so, of course, that's the Christian view of this. And it's not that you don't deserve punishment. It's that someone else, Jesus, has taken that punishment. And so, but if you take the Jesus out of it, then you still have this desire to punish others. It reminds me of a sermon a while back of talking about forgiving others, and how if you don't understand just how much Jesus has done for you, then you want to punish other people. And so So yeah, and I think that can apply to government too, where you have this idea of like you have to punish other people. But I think one of the things I liked about the Higdon article was how if we don't understand that people are sinful, then we kind of expect this perfection, and that God can still use imperfect people and through common grace and other means. And yeah, if we miss that in the past, then we'll miss it in the future when we forget it in ourselves and others.
Mark LiVecche, this should be a topic right up your alley. Robert Juster's review of The Myth of Nuclear Revolution, a book which, as I understand it, argues that nuclear weapons, in fact, did not transform humanity or the way nations interact with each other, but rather there's a continuity there. It's a weapon obviously far more lethal than any other, and yet human nature remains unchanged. While the book also acknowledges that nuclear weapons have, in fact, repressed the overall frequency of warfare over the last 75 years through the effect of deterrence. So the book comes down somewhat favorably towards nuclear weapons, which the reviewer Robert Juster finds potentially a little bit troubling, and he wishes the book had at least given some more analysis to the possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons, which I presume the authors found to be completely untenable. What are your thoughts, Mark LiVecche?
Yeah, well, I haven't read this book, but this review, like a good review should, has made me want to read it. So I look forward to it. Yeah, there's several things to be said. Justra forwards a provocative claim that the book makes, that not only are they, sort of neutrally sanguine about the role of nukes in the world, but they actually say nuclear weapons have made the world a better place. That's a strong statement. It's eye-catching, it's great advertising. Has it made it a better place? He's right to cite, as they cite, that nuclear weapons almost indisputably have limited large-scale conventional battles. There has not been a World War III. It's quite possible that in the absence of nuclear weapons, we would have had a state-to-state great power conflict with the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons prevented that from happening. On the one hand, my analysis of that is, well, that's a good thing. On the other hand, I have Hungarian friends who wish in 1956. I have Czechoslovak friends whose grandparents and parents would have wished that in 1968, maybe there was a little bit more of a fight between the Soviets and the West. So you could say, well, the nukes have prevented certain large-scale conflicts, but certain conflicts probably ought to have been fought, and nuclear weapons prevented us from having them. So again, like everything in human history, and this gestures to the wisdom of the author's claims, nuclear weapons haven't changed all that much. They are a mixed bag. They have brought certain goods, and they have brought certain ills, certain limitations in the world. I suspect, just like the longbow, nuclear weapons have changed conflict. It hasn't been a wholesale change. It certainly hasn't changed Christian ethics or military ethics. The same moral calculus that we've always applied to weapons have to be applied to nuclear weapons. So I don't think it's changed all that much, but it has made being right about the things we argue with probably a heck of a lot more vital. That's one thing.
And finally, Mark Melton, you dared to challenge our patron, Saint Reinhold Niebuhr, in terms of how he analyzed the end of World War II and America's or the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender from the Axis, including Japan. So tell us a little bit about your critique of Reinhold Niebuhr in 1945.
Well, first off, Reinhold Niebuhr made a lot of arguments in 1945 against unconditional surrender, and to kind of set those aside of whether he was right or wrong on we should have demanded unconditional surrender from the Japanese and the Nazis. The issue I take with him in this article is that he says that Japan did not surrender unconditionally, that we offered them the condition of allowing them to keep the emperor. And we did allow them to keep the emperor, though it seems a bit more fuzzy than what he said in the op-ed. And also he said that the Germans were more likely, the Germans were less likely to surrender. The Japanese were more likely to negotiate if we just relented on this unconditional surrender demand. And my issue with that is, one, a lot more Germans surrendered, a lot more soldiers surrendered at the end of World War II than Japanese, say at Battle of Okinawa or what was the other one I cited? Iwo Jima. And so I think he's factually wrong on that. And I think he should have known that in 1945 because that happened earlier. He also, I think, is wrong that, Japan did surrender unconditionally. The paper they signed said unconditional surrender. So I think he's factually wrong on that. And also, on the emperor part, maybe LiVecche can correct me on this. From what I was able to tell, it wasn't clear. They were going to keep an emperor. I think it seemed unclear of who would be that emperor at first. Eventually, they kept, how do you pronounce this? Hirohito, I think. Right. So they kept him, but I think it was announced later on in September after Niebuhr would have written this. And so I think he should have known better on the facts on the ground, but it just seems like he was making the same argument over and over again. And so he just repeated the argument without really fact checking of what, reading the papers of what actually happened when Japan surrendered. And so, yeah, that's where I kind of pick a bone with him. And I kind of mentioned the pride of pundits where people keep making the same arguments without actually analyzing, does the evidence prove what they're saying, or are they just rattling off an op-ed without doing much research?
It is a strange argument, Melton, because on the one hand, the argument that they were ready to surrender was a common one at the time. You know that Elizabeth Anscombe made the same argument. So lots of people forwarded that, and you could continue pressing that one forward if you wanted to dogmatically. But the assertion that they didn't, in fact, surrender unconditionally, that's a little bit more bizarre. So good for you.
Well, Mark LiVecche, as a just war scholar, what do you think about the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender from the Axis powers? Obviously, they wanted to avoid the mistakes of 1918, 1919. They didn't want there to be any equivocation about who the actual victors were.
Yeah, if you ask me to give one word to justify unconditional surrender in World War II, I might say Auschwitz. I might say, a couple other things, but I would probably say Versailles. I think that's absolutely true. The Japanese and the Germans in 1945 needed to know that they had been beaten, and in both instances, that was made abundantly clear. They needed to stand down. Japanese militarism, Nazi fascism had to be defeated. unequivocally, both for the good, I think, of the world, but for an endurable peace. And so yeah, I mean, I've said this in justification for the dropping of the bomb. The demand for unconditional surrender was absolutely appropriate, and it's just clear through the historic record. It's still controversial. I understand that, but Ms. Campbell does a great job. Frank does a great job of demonstrating how the Japanese were nowhere close to actually being willing to surrender under any conditions that would have been remotely acceptable to the Allies. So you push, and we didn't know. I mean, with the question that Niebuhr raises with Hirohito, I've said this ad nauseum at this point. I'll continue to say it. The idea that we should just, vindicate Hirohito ahead of time before we really understood the role he played in World War II is silly. Nobody would have made the same argument about Hitler, and so we shouldn't have made the argument about Hirohito. Both leaders needed to stand trial for what they did, and they did. They investigated Hirohito. They found him worthy of being kept on, but to have made that claim ahead of time would have been an injustice.
Mark LiVecche, Mark Melton, thank you for another round of Marxism. Till next week, bye-bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.